Imagine you sign up for an activity. The moment you get into the event until you get out, you can clock the time. Then you can have very granular input of your personality and how you interact with the event.
Web3 offers a brand new petri dish.
Our job is to buy great tech at great prices.
AI is also libertarian, right?
Enable use case that people haven't been able to do today.
The next hundreds of millions of players, and they will come to the market through mobile.
My personal reason why I could be bullish in the next 12 months is Blockcrunch is not a licensed financial advisor and is purely for informational and entertainment purposes only. All opinions are personal, and the show may discuss assets that the host or guests have positions in or may be actively buying or selling. All investments carry risk, so consult with a financial professional before making any investment decisions. Welcome to another episode of Blockcrunch. I'm your host, Jason Choi, co-founder of Tangent, a prop investing vehicle in crypto. Now, for our roundtable session, where we discuss the latest VC trends and thesis in crypto, I'm excited to be joined by my co-host once again, Sanat Kapoor from Dragonfly Capital. Now, in the last roundtable, we talked about why VCs like to focus on infra and not applications in crypto, and why we want to see more applications. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the infra side of things. What is exactly the end game for backing a bazillion L1s and L2s, and whether any L1s or L2s can actually challenge the incumbents like Ethereum and Solana. And to add more credibility to this, I brought on a mutual portfolio founder of ours, Shuyao, just to make it fair. Shuyao is the co-founder of real-time blockchain MegaETH. So we're going to talk about technical, social, and the financial implications of building the blockchain to rule them all. Now, to give a little bit of context, I came across MegaETH about 6 months ago, and they were on an ambitious mission to get a chain that can produce 100,000 transactions per second, which is more than what Visa today processes and leagues above what any blockchain is capable of doing. Now, to do this, they've also assembled the Avengers equivalent of a co-founding team with Yilong Li, who is a PhD at Stanford working on consensus, Lei Yang, who is a PhD at MIT working on networks, and Shuyao, who was the global head of business development at Consensus for 7 years after getting an MBA from Harvard. Now, most interestingly, they're pursuing centralized block production, where they have one full node producing blocks, but decentralized verification by having a large network of lighter weight nodes safeguard the work of that node. Now, that's an oversimplification. I will attach more of the technical docs in the notes below for those who are interested. But it's a surprisingly controversial and extremely technical and nuanced trade-off with implications on both the technical and social side, which we'll touch on. Now, at the end, I'll also touch on some tactics for scaling your developer or token communities, and also force us to set aside our back biases to make everyone talk about what the other chains that they think are doing a good job. And I even put my co-host Sanat on the spot by asking him why his fund invested in two of the next-gen blockchains, Monad and MegaETH, who recently had a somewhat heated debate between their co-founders in another podcast as well. So this will be a very fun one as usual. So without further ado, let's get started.
Pleasure to be here.
Very, very excited to have you on, Shuyao. So you've done a few podcasts recently, but I think this one will be the most kind of broad in terms of like covering the high level of why we even need L1s or L2s and kind of the approach to creating winning ones. And I'm going to name this episode the most expensive question in crypto because I think this one question explains how most VC capital flows, right? We recently saw a pre-product L1 called Story Protocol raised at like $3 billion valuation, and people still act surprised that these are being done. But Sanat and I actually discussed in the last episode why VCs in crypto fund so much more infra than apps. And the TLDR is the reward for nailing the next Solana or the next Ethereum is so big, right? Ethereum is 280 billion, Solana is 60 billion. So when the reward is so big, people naturally gravitate towards them. So that's why I think the most important question really in crypto for a lot of investors is, will there be a next Solana or Ethereum type of outcome? So in other words, why do we still need more infra? What's the end game for infra? So Shuyao, given you're building the next big infra, I'm curious what your take is on this first.
Yeah, so my first reaction was we should add Tron on that list as well. I think there are a bunch of protocol that has product market fit and ETH, Bitcoin, Tron, Solana. So from our perspective, obviously we love infra the way that's different from VCs love infra. I think they are the foundation layer of why we're being here. But I'd love to answer your question from the word endgame perspective. We actually, as a team, never thought about we're building any sort of endgame. We believe that if we're in the industry, you're always pushing toward the frontier. There's always going to be a blockchain that's much faster, performant, more decentralized, etc. However, we've started talking about ourselves as an endgame blockchain, very much thanks to Vitalik. So apparently in his 2021 blog post, which is entitled Endgame, he said the endgame of a scalable blockchain is one where you have relatively centralized block production and very decentralized and trustless block validating network. And that's exactly what MegaETH is. So maybe selfishly, to answer your question, we believe that we are building some sort of endgame for blockchain within the near future time limit. But we also really genuinely believe that everyone should advance in the better direction of building better base layer. Because if we can't get better base layer, we can't really build better dApps.
Before we get started, I'm grateful for Aptos for sponsoring the show and letting us continue to make this free content for all. So here's Jerome from Aptos to tell us a little bit more. Jerome, Aptos is gaining traction with entities interested in bridging traditional finance with DeFi. Some notable developments are Ondo Finance's integration of Aptos, which brings institutional-grade finance on-chain, and ecosystem project Aptos Labs becoming a strategic investor in Securitize, which is an RWA platform offering tokenized fund investments. So can you explain why Aptos is such an attractive network for onboarding Web2 financial markets and services?
So Aptos is the world's fastest, most reliable, interoperable Layer 1 blockchain, making it the fastest, most accessible payment rail in the world. For quick context, Visa processes 1,600 transactions per second. Aptos supports 30,000 transactions per second. That's 18 times faster than Visa and feels instantaneous to users. For this reason, Aptos isn't just a blockchain fit to bring RWAs on-chain, it is the blockchain for bridging the TradFi DeFi gap. In addition to Ondo and Securitize developments, Aptos Labs, in collaboration with Brevin Howard, BCG, SK Telecom, and Microsoft, announced Aptos Ascend, a suite of blockchain-based tools and features on the Aptos blockchain designed to meet the requirements of financial institutions, while at the same time leveraging the openness, scalability, security, speed, and reliability of the public Aptos network. Aptos Ascend will provide a Web3 path for any major bank or financial institution in the world to begin offering digital asset and asset management services to their clients' responsibility and at scale. It represents a massive step forward in bridging the gap between TradFi and DeFi innovation with the industry's key stakeholders. This opportunity to bridge the institutional Web3 gap in the name of open finance is huge, it's global, and it's playing out at Aptos thanks to the speed, with our low time to finality, our reliability, 99.99% uptime, and cost efficiency, with 100 times lower gas fees than other prominent L1s.
Thanks, Jerome. Now back to the episode. When you say better base layer, does it mean like faster, or is it kind of more different features, or maybe supports more type of coding languages? What are the metrics that you think in terms of, okay, if this is the endgame blockchain, these are the things that we need that the current blockchains don't have?
Yeah, I think definitely faster. Latency is something we really, really care about, and we believe that has been neglected by a lot of founders. If we can reduce the latency to Web 2 level, we can really enable a lot better user experiences. We think security is an interesting metric as well, even with tokenomics, right? There are so many facades in what a good blockchain is. I think most people just reduce blockchain into performance into throughput, and throughput by itself is a measurement of capacity, not capability. And more importantly, throughput is a measurement of utilization. So people often say like, oh, why do we need more block space? Like, look at Solana, it hasn't really hit the TPS. Like, what are these infra projects? But that doesn't mean like we don't need more chain. It just means like most of the current applications are not utilizing the chain the way we should be.
I'm curious, like for Sana, right, from an investor's perspective, you look at a lot of L1s and L2s as well. What are you actually looking for when you want to back the next L1? Like what are you thinking of, hey, Solana has like, 10,000 transactions per second right now. We need like to hit 100,000. Is there like a metric that you try to see if certain L1s hit, or what kind of, what makes you decide to write a check to, hey, I'm going to back this new L1?
It's a good question. I won't mention any specific metrics because metrics get gamed very, very fast. There's like TPS, and then people found a way to kind of game TPS, and then we kind of went to gas per second, and even that gets gamed. I think as an investor, it's incumbent upon you to understand like what performance really means and what kind of performance people are looking for. People will throw around terms like parallel, and then you have to think about, okay, what happens when a certain like there is one NFT that everyone wants to mint and you can't parallelize it, and how blockchains respond to situations like that. And so I think the infrastructure conversation is nuanced enough that I can't tell you like, oh, if you had X TPS, we would write you a check. Like, that's just not how it works anymore. I think a couple of things. One is, broadly though, I think it's not so hard to make the bet that 10 years in the future, people will want cheaper and faster secure block space. Now, there's many different ways to interpret that, but that's actually one of the easier bets to make in crypto. Like, for example, other things, you could be betting that NFTs will matter in 10 years. And that's actually kind of risky right now because NFTs don't seem to matter right now. But at a high level saying, yeah, I think people will want cheaper and faster block space to do whatever they want to do on a blockchain. Seems like a pretty easy, not risky bet to make in its own way. I think the thing we're thinking about though is that like strategically positioning towards app developers is becoming more and more important. And so, you know, when you start, you have Ethereum, and Ethereum can kind of be a home for everything because it's the first place where there are smart contracts. And then Solana is like, okay, actually we're way cheaper and way more performant. And so it's in like the space of strategic things you can do as a blockchain now is like, it requires more unique positioning. It requires a very differentiated pitch to app developers. And that can be different things. You can have vibes-based pitches that actually take off. Blast is effectively a vibes-based pitch that did pretty well. They were like, yeah, we gamble here. And a bunch of people came and built gambling apps there. And it kind of worked for a while. I'm obviously biased. I think MegaETH's pitch being more performant than almost any other blockchain that we can imagine right now, and pushing kind of the roll-up trade-off spectrum to its edge is one that should appeal to developers. But yeah, I think you have to work backwards, look at what developers want. And kind of, I do think it is true that the kind of strategic positioning is becoming harder and harder for every blockchain that gets launched these days, given that Solana and Ethereum have kind of occupied a lot of the space in the narrative room.
I would just add one thing. I think it's just really competitive, honestly, like as a blockchain founder. You have to have a differentiated technology. You need to have risk. You have really good swags. I often joke that MegaETH is a fashion company, and we put so much time and effort in our swags, and it's actually becoming competitive advantage at some point. But joke aside, I think the other thing that a lot of people overlook is the surrounding infrastructure with the blockchain. You know, I came from consensus, right? My entire crypto career was on wallet, RPC, data indexing, etc. I think a lot of blockchains don't really put much attention on these middlewares. As a result, their application developers are not just getting a good dev experiences. And as a result, then the end user are not using the chain effectively. If I think about what Solana has done really well, I think, you know, the iteration of wallet on Solana has, you know, done magic. People overlook on that quite a lot.
I guess actually on that front, I'm curious how you think about differentiation, in as much as one of the reasons that people really like launching clone EVM blockchains or blockchains that look very similar to other blockchains, that is actually really easy. Some indexer will be like, okay, well, we index this other Geth fork. We can index your Geth fork as well. It's not so complicated. MetaMask will work out of the box. And so there's a weird trade-off where if you want to actually start from scratch, it makes your job much harder, where like, I imagine at the performance scale you guys are running at, indexing is hard. It's much harder than it is to index like a normal EVM chain. So I'm curious how you guys think about those trade-offs. And in particular, Solana took a while. Like Solana indexers and Solana block explorers. Solana block explorers still kind of suck, if I'm being honest. And so I'm curious, as you guys do so much of this stuff from scratch, how you kind of bootstrap that infra ecosystem, or how you think about trade-offs with compatibility.
Yeah, I mean, dude, no pain, no gain, right? If you get your block space very easily forking someone else, or just, you know, rust it out, then you don't get moat, you don't get loyalty at all. You do get easier infrastructure, but if no one uses it, then yeah, it doesn't make sense. Even when I was working on Infura, you know, Infura only supports a few chains, and it's always a very strategic decision, because every chain you support, you're putting a lot of work beforehand. If you don't get developer activities, then it's pretty much a wasteful resources. So even for non-differentiated blockchain, getting these middlewares can be difficult. You have to either pay, or you have to, like, I don't know, raw dog yourself into that company, and they'll really love you. But yeah, and your second question on us, yeah, you know, RPC data indexing will be extremely difficult. We have to work with people who believe in us from scratch. But more importantly, we are working with our dApp ecosystem directly. Right? If we just work with an independent data indexer without looping in our dApp builders, we never know whether this new data indexer actually works well with, for example, our spot DEX. I was literally just on a call with founder of Rabby. We're talking about, wallet support. And the most important thing, again, is data indexing. So I need to work with him to make sure that whatever he stands up to integrate with MegaETH actually works. So it's a lot of dirty work, to be honest. You have to really think it through before you just launch a chain and inshallah hoping it works. It doesn't.
People underestimate the difficulty of doing a very fast chain. They think, okay, we're just going to make bigger blocks and slightly more centralized block production, and then everything will be fast. But all the piping needs to be reworked just because of the speed. I remember when Solana first came out, the indexing was so hard that I think developers were having a lot of issues on the testnet. I'm just trying out apps. This is during the serum days as well. But before I move on to kind of the technical trade-offs that people have to make to get this type of performance, I'd like to just quickly close out on the endgame point. Because I think, Sanat, you mentioned that TPS is very easily gamed, but in my mind, in my 100 IQ type of framework, I always use TPS as the kind of benchmark, because when I think of Visa, right? Visa has 65,000 transactions per second, and then something like Solana, I believe, is 2,000 to 3,000. I could be wrong on this, but you can see that even some of the fastest chains in crypto are quite far away from Web 2 infrastructure. So when I first spoke with the MegaETH team and they mentioned that, hey, we're gonna do this construction to reach 100,000 transactions per second, that's a type of scale that I have in my mind when I think of Web 3 eventually reaching kind of Web 2 parity. So to me, that's the end game, getting very, very fast transaction per second and very fast throughput. But obviously the big catch here is, how is that possible, right? So I'd like to kind of go into the technical side, which is, what are the main trade-offs that L1s and L2s can make to increase their throughput? Because obviously, a lot of us know about the scalability trilemma that Vitalik wrote about. And to put it very simplistically, in most cases, when you want to make a faster chain, you need to make things a little bit more centralized. But I think for MegaETH, you guys are doing something quite interesting with this concept of node specialization and kind of challenging what does it mean by actually a centralized chain? How do we measure decentralization? So do you want to touch on that a bit? And I know there's also a recent debate with the founder of Monad on another podcast about kind of what a full node actually means. So we can get into all that in a bit.
So in terms of the layer 1, layer 2 trade-off to get performance, it's actually pretty straightforward. As a layer 1 is forced to make the trade-off between performance and decentralization, period. If a layer 1 wants to get performance, the only way to do is either jack up their hardware, which means they automatically becomes really centralized, or they might improve their software for a little bit, but that doesn't give them the performance increase that they desire. So L1 is forced to make such trade-off. And that's why a good layer 1 should always optimize on decentralization, because we believe it's harder part to get. So now what is the trade-off layer 2? Because everything is in trade-off. The layer 2 trade-off isn't on performance, because you can jack up your hardware like what MegaETH does, centralize and optimize it to get performance. But because you are using a base layer, a layer 1 as your decentralization, aka security and censorship resistance guarantee, you still get the decentralization benefits, but what you're losing is finality. So the common critique trade-off for layer 2 has always been, yo, dude, you have to wait for 7 days for you to settle back on the challenge period. Or you can say, wait until ZK proof that you have instant finality. To us, you know what? We are performance maxis. Our stronghold is on the execution environment. We are not proof experts. We believe that someone will figure out a ZK way to have instant finality onto layer 1. It's going to happen. We're optimistic, but we're going to use someone else who does it better. Our job is to make the performance as extreme as possible. So that would be my answer on the layer 1 and layer 2 trade-off. Now, going off that, why does MegaETH can be so performance optimized. So yeah, after understanding the layer 1, layer 2 performance trade-off, I can go a bit deeper into node specialization. By the way, for those of you who are listening, my co-founder and CTO Lei does this fantastic YouTube videos that explain technical concepts. You guys should all check it out. He explained way better than I do. So what is node specialization? If we go back to what layer 1 does, right? Layer 1 is actually a very homogeneous network, which means that every layer 1 node does exactly the same thing. Imagine having 1,000 laptops that runs the same math problem all over the world. What does it mean? You get a lot of duplication. It would be really nice if you have one laptop that does the work and the rest just copy. That's what node specialization is. When you have a lot of redundancy, all your node has to wait for the slowest one to complete a task in order to move on to the next task. That's why layer 1 can never be scalable because all the nodes do the same thing. Now going into MegaETH and rollup, we can actually take the layer 1 task, the layer 1 nodes, and configure them into special hardware and software. So for example, what MegaETH's secret sauce is, we concentrate the heavy lifting of execution into one beefy centralized server. So this server just like churning out blocks all the time, really fast, 100,000 TPS, millisecond latency. But then in the meantime, to compensate for the performance coming from the centralized sequencer, we have very decentralized validating network. So you have node that specialize in producing blocks and node specialize in validating blocks. So that's why we're the most performant blockchain.
So I guess just to double click on that, right? I think the best way that, at least for me, to think about decentralization is what sort of risks are you opening up yourself to as you veer more to the centralized part? So let's say like tomorrow someone drops a missile on that server room and blows it up. Then what happens to MegaETH?
Or someone, there's a bad actor on our centralized sequencer. So you would still have escape hatch, a forced exit going back to layer 1. So that's one way say like layer 2 derive security from layer 1, because there's always this path going back to the base layer that is completely decentralized, right? I think a second way, a second improvement we're working on is actually rotational sequencer. So we are not fan of decentralized sequencer because we are performance maxi. The moment you have decentralized sequencer, you're sacrificing performance. However, a rotational sequencer is very different. So you would still have multiple sequencer, but at any moment you have one that execute transaction. So if a bomb that hits one, you just rotate to another one that still does the job without sacrificing performance.
And Sana, I think as a VC, you probably see a lot of different L2s that have explored at least similar constructions. I know there's a lot of discussion for like the big L2s around decentralize the sequencer or not decentralizing the sequencer. So how would you categorize MegaETH in terms of the trade-offs it's making, and among other L2s or L1s that you've seen? And have you seen any other changes doing this approach before?
Honestly, not really. The only two teams that I know that are working that kind of came at this from different angles are Eclipse and MegaETH. Broadly, I think one of the things we noticed is that, of course, Arbitrum and Optimism were super successful because they were kind of the first chains that proved that, hey, we can actually make a much faster, cheaper EVM. And then we kind of realized, one, it isn't that much faster or that much cheaper, but it's cool. It still enables new use cases. Unfortunately, most of the L2s that launched after that, and I've spoken about this previously, kind of feel boring. Like the block space is uninteresting, particularly relative to Arbitrum or Optimism. And from a user perspective, they don't feel that different. Like, it is just true that if you're using linear or scroll, it doesn't feel like magical in any way. And I think neither from the app developer's perspective nor from the user's perspective. And one of the things is that obviously ZK tech is cooler than optimistic tech in some ways, but it's hard to feel for either a user or an app developer. And so I think actually, like, one of the reasons we're really excited about MegaETH is that it pushes the frontiers of what like an L2 can be. And I think Optimism and Arbitrum were like a good first attempt at showing like what like L2s are possible. And then we have to kind of push forward. And a lot of people try to kind of just recreate the mold of optimism and Arbitrum. And we still see pitches like that. And I think most of those pitches are pretty uninteresting, unfortunately. So that's maybe one way that I've seen a lot of L2 pitches go down.
I want to double click on this point on the full node as well. I know this is apparently a very, very sensitive topic for crypto since the beginning of Ethereum, let's say. But okay, just so we can...
It's sensitive from the beginning of Bitcoin, just to be clear. Like the Bitcoin maxis have fought about full nodes as well.
So 2008. So there's no way we're going to resolve this thing on this 1 hour podcast. But just to give some context, I think by and large, the kind of retail or a mainstream consensus of what a full node is basically you have blockchains and you have a bunch of nodes that are heavy duty nodes, right? They verify every single transaction on a blockchain. They keep a full history of every transaction or of the state, right? So these are like full backup copies of your device. So for Ethereum, according to I think ethernodes.org, not all of the full nodes are publicly queryable, but I think according to Ethernodes, there's like 6,000. Solana has like 4,400. According to Solana Compass, Bitcoin has almost 20,000 according to BitNodes. So in MegaETH terms, does that mean MegaETH has like one like full node, but then a bunch of other nodes that are don't fit into the conventional definition of full node, but you achieve kind of decentralization by having those nodes kind of check the work of that full node? Is that kind of the right intuition for it?
Yeah, and I think that's what Sanet meant by we're the most interesting experimentation for layer 2. We completely decoupled execution environment from the layer 2 full node. That allows us to concentrate the heavy lifting into the sequencer. And then for the rest of the full node, we make them extremely light, so they can, like, anyone can run them, right? Like you can actually run it on your phone. So our full node, by definition, is very different explanation from others because we did this decoupling. But I think, I think that debate got us to reflect quite a lot. I do think, on the one hand, we can say we use a different definition, but on the other hand, it just completely reflects our design philosophy. We don't believe that a node has to execute all the transaction. Even with our validating node, it's so light because not all the validating node is actually validating each transaction. They're only validating a subset of all the transactions. So we're doing all the optimization to make sure that the chain is performant without sacrificing the decentralization. So I think it's on the one hand, it's a definitional difference, but it's really a design principle difference.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, why no other chain? I know you kind of mentioned this on another podcast as well, but why no other chain has explored this trade-off? Is there some kind of like gaping risk that you get if you just have like one centralized block production that all these L2s are just not willing to take? Or is it just like such a high bar in terms of like the technical optimization you need and all the indexing things that Sanat mentioned that is required before you can get this chain to work, that there's a very high barrier to entry, that not everyone can build this? Like, why has no one else explored the same trade-off that you guys are exploring when they're trying to build these fast blockchains?
I mean, I would say it's my co-founders, but they told me not to mention them because, they're humble devs. I think the honest answer is the design is very unorthodox. Everyone was going after consensus. Everyone has like different fancy ZK proof. No one actually thought about going after the execution environment. Even Vitalik wrote about it. So I think we're the one who actually, because of Elon and my co-founder's background, it becomes very intuitive for them to explore this area. And they also have the engineering talent to actually implement the solution. So one thing, I want to continue to emphasize is, you ask, is our speed coming from no specialization? I said yes or no. So yes, because, we do have the centralized beefy sequencer, but that's really a fraction of it. We've done so much software optimization on top of the sequencer that makes it like a step function improvement, right? It's not just like slightly better. This is like a rocketry better, as one of our Mega Mafia builder told me today. It's not linear improvement, it's rocketry. So, and a lot of these software improvements extremely difficult, Jason. Like, we rewrote the entire state try. Like, we realized that Merkleization is 99% of the performance bottleneck. We're just like, screw that. We're going to rewrite the whole thing. We're using JIT compiling. We are doing our own parallelization. We're not using BlockSTM or anyone else that's out there in the open source world. So it's both a architectural design choice as well as a software optimization.
This kind of reminds me of like Solana back in 18 as well. I know I almost reference this every episode just because I really index a lot of things to kind of the Solana story because it's one of the big kind of stories of victory in crypto, right? From startup to like major blockchain. And I remember back in 2018 when they put out the paper, Proof of History, about kind of parallelizing and optimizing for optimizing for speed using hardware. A lot of people were asking the same question, like, how come no one has done this? And the answer was really as simple as because Anatoly, the founder, was a hardware guy for like 10, 20 years, right? It's actually a lot harder to build these chains and kind of tackle the low-level technical problems if you don't have like 10, 20 years under your belt in that specific domain. And Shuyao, you mentioned that your co-founders, very humble, but they kind of came from that background as well. So I think that's a very convincing answer. But I'd love to kind of pivot a little bit and put the spotlight on Sadat as well, because I think the two big, I don't think you guys call yourself Solana killers, but the market is kind of discussing you guys in the context of like chains that could compete with Solana in terms of the speed and scale and the ambition. The two big ones that I hear the most are MegaETH and Monad. So Dragonfly, you guys invested in both of them. So Sadat, can you explain to us, okay, what are the differences between these two things? Like, what are the trade-offs they're making? Are they both trying to go for the same thing? But what kind of trade-offs are they making here in order to achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should just start by saying the Monad investment predates my joining Dragonfly, and so I'm less familiar with it. Though obviously I know our thinking around it. It's kind of hard for me to answer because Shuyao actually did a very eloquent job explaining the trade-off space that L1 stake and L2 stake. And I think broadly those two approaches lead to pretty different kind of outcomes for users, for security trade-offs, for the way you're thinking about what matters. They lead to a different profile for assets on the chain. Like I said, I think broadly, I don't wake up in the morning and think there'll be one blockchain in 10 years. I don't think that. And so we've invested in other blockchains as well. And we think there are like interesting, like exploring interesting, like I think maybe the way to put it is we generally like founders who are willing to explore interesting points on the trade-off spectrum. And we find founders who are kind of just sticking to the same points kind of boring. And I think in their own way, both of these chains, like Monad is trying to push what a highly performant EVM L1 could look like. And MegaETH is basically saying, okay, what if we just pushed, like we used the L2 trade-off spectrum, like relinquished the job of verification largely to the L1 and then pushed performance to its absolute maximum. And so I don't know if that answers. I'm actually struggling to answer because Shuyao actually just did explain what L1 versus L2s are, and that was kind of what I would kind of respond with.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I want to touch on that because one of the Monad's main pitches is that it's going to be the most performant EVM compatible layer 1. And I think it's interesting that MegaETH, also one of the things that you guys emphasize is being aligned with Ethereum as well. So help us understand this kind of social layer. What is the difference between EVM compatible, Ethereum alignment, and Ethereum foundation alignment? Like, why are these things important?
These things are not important. Like, I genuinely do not think, but I want to explain why I don't think they're important. I think EVM compatibility is, it's a standard. Again, I used to run wallets, right? Like, no one cares whether you're at layer 1, layer 2, whatsoever, as long as, they can use it on MetaMask, and most of them are EVM compatible. So to me, it's just like a design choice, a base layer. And then the question about Ethereum foundation, I think the foundation just does what's good for the chain, the ecosystem, the asset. What do I need to do with it? I'm not certain. I love to contribute whenever we have more technical findings. But so far it's like, I don't consider that as part of my success metric. I think the last one, to align with the Ethereum ethos, is probably the most important one to my heart.
What is the Ethereum ethos actually in the context of L2s?
I would say, like, let me let me retrace and talk a bit about my personal experience. And I think that represents what our team really believes in. So most of our team coming from countries that actually need blockchain. Like we come from countries that, get currency depreciation, censorship, etc. Our team actually believe in decentralized technology. Surprise. Like, we love token, but we believe in decentralized tech stack. So Ethereum to us is simply the most decentralized and censorship resistant layer one. Like people often ask us like, oh, can you guys not be Ethereum layer two? And we're just like, we can't. We're a centralized sequencer. We need a decentralized base layer. We can't. Like we can't abandon Ethereum. Plus we love the Ethereum ethos and community, which is, really building anti-fragile technology for majority of the world. So we are aligned with Ethereum in terms of that. And our company mission, honestly, is in fact to build decentralized technology, empower people to build decentralized application for the world digital economy. And we truly believe that. So does it have to be manifested with the Ethereum social layer? I don't think so. But I genuinely think we're the most Ethereum aligned protocol out there because we're the only one that has to use Ethereum's decentralization to be who we are.
And I would actually challenge the view that EVM compatibility is not important. Just from a commercial perspective, it seems like EVM is probably the greatest export of Ethereum in that once you are EVM compatible, you can tap into the huge user base that MetaMask has, at least relative to all the other Ethereum wallets. But at the same time, obviously Solana was the big exception to this, right? Like people were quite dismissive of Solana in the beginning because it didn't try to be EVM compatible. It didn't try to use MetaMask. They needed their own wallets. The first wallet was like Solid from FTX, and it was absolute dog shit before Phantom came around. But they still managed to win. So I'm curious, like Katsana, you mentioned that being EVM compatible and kind of forking EVM chains is a very fast way to get to market for L1 founders. Why do you think people were wrong about Solana when they look at Solana and said that, hey, it's not EVM compatible, it's going to be beat out by Avalanche?
It's tricky because I think the answer is definitely overdetermined. Like one could say, okay, if you're going to have a different ecosystem, you need someone to help you bootstrap. They had FTX. And they had Multicoin that like pushed very hard to make developers build stuff like this. I think developers may be willing to explore new trade-off spaces when there's like a huge performance gain to be had. But I do think it's very path dependent. I think Solana kind of had access to a special crop of developers, had kind of a lot of support from an ecosystem, had a lot of people willing to fund developers, making a lot of experiments and failing, which is kind of the way these things get bootstrapped. Maybe one way to contrast it is with the Move ecosystem, where actually if you talk to developers who are writing in Move, they will tell you Move is actually an excellent way to write smart contracts. It is really secure. People are really excited, and maybe these things just move on slower time frames. But unfortunately, over the past few years, Move hasn't managed to get that adoption. It's hard for me to answer why. There are some devs, they have got funding. There's no FTX behind them. The user experiences that were created were not super unique. And the truth is that the user experiences that were created on Solana at first were unique. Like at that time, no one could run anything resembling Serum on any other blockchain. And so it was pretty cool that someone built an order book that ran on a blockchain. Eventually, most trading on Solana happened on AMMs, which is funny. But I think there's a time, there's a place, there's like differentiation. Today, if you try to launch a totally new blockchain with a totally new programming language, I think you would struggle unless there were very, very clear trade-offs that kind of helped. And some of these trade-offs are also long-term. Like one of the trade-offs around Move is that it's more secure. And security is one of those things that is like a nice to have, but no one is like you can't feel it. You can't feel it every day until things get hacked. And so I struggle to give you like one answer. I really think like the story of Solana has Anatoly involved, has FTX involved, has investors kind of backing it, has kind of Phantom being a default wallet, has apps like Pump.fun and meme coins trading there. Like which one is the reason that people manage to write programs for in a different language is very hard to answer.
Since we're on the question of searching for the next big L1s, obviously a big trend. I wouldn't say it's a trend, but a big kind of point of interest for investors and maybe some developers alike were Aptos and Sui, right? When the Move kind of language was positioned as this new way to get to developers outside of crypto. So as a L1 co-founder, Shuyao, obviously you guys are not building with Move now, but I'm assuming you guys have kind of thought about that angle. What are your thoughts on like the Move blockchains? Like, is that a good wedge to get developers? And, is that something that was, ever part of the conversation when you guys were deciding, okay, what kind of languages should we support for MegaETH?
Yeah, we're a big fan of Move, actually. I think we pioneer a bunch of parallelization, security and all of that. To us, it was quite out of the question because obviously, you mentioned that EVM does have a lot of market share and just like developer education. But more importantly, I don't think changing a language matters that much to developer onboarding. So my answer to why I think a Move language did not take off was, the initial batch of application on Move just weren't that interesting, right? They were not utilizing the Move language to have like direct user benefits. Like you don't feel using Move is that a Move is different from like on a fast like Ethereum layer 2. So I think that's what they missed. Whereas on Solana pioneered use cases that you just can't find it anywhere, right? They were the first one to talk about DePIN. And by the way, most of the Solana DePINs don't even use Solana. They can't because that chain doesn't allow real-time computation. And by the way, we do. So I think the major difference is if you can't have a differentiated application on your chain, no matter how good the language is, how secure the language, it does not matter. So, as a blockchain founder, to me is I offer the language that's most familiar to the users, and I make sure that I work with founders who are actually pushing the 0 to 1 use cases.
Yeah, and I think we're moving on to my favorite part of this conversation, which is the tactical part, because my view is, yes, the tech side is incredibly important and difficult, but beyond a certain threshold, especially as more smart people come into this space, you have to compete on distribution, right? You have to actually get developers to build on a chain. You can build the fastest chain, the most secure chain. If no one builds on it, you still lose out. So I love to focus on kind of what you guys are doing on the getting developers part, because most of our conversations actually before we got involved as investors was actually around this part. It wasn't even about the technical part. It was because I thought you guys were very, very thoughtful about bootstrapping that ecosystem. And sure, this is not the first ecosystem you've bootstrapped as well, because you've also done it before at Consensus. So let's start with the question about apps, right? This year, a big theme has been, we want more apps. We don't want to back more infra. Everybody keeps saying that. But besides perpetual swap exchanges and some prediction markets, there haven't really been very interesting applications that took off huge. Maybe there were some social things that ended up being somewhat of a flash in the pan. Have there been ever kind of builders that came to you, or maybe in Sanat's case, to come to your Porco L1s that say that, hey, we want to build this really interesting application. It's not available anywhere else, but all the chains out there just can't support what we want to build. What are some examples there?
All the time. You'd be really surprised. I'll give you 3 examples on top of my head. So Biome, the team is building a fully on-chain Minecraft. They were trying to use one of the OP stack, Redstone. They just broke the chain, right? The moment they launched. The chain was not performing enough for them to have WASD. So you have like this other person somewhere there to direct, where your little character goes. And MegaETH is actually the only environment that a fully on-chain Minecraft can operate in because of our latency. When you have low latency, you have high tick rate, and that's really important in a game design. Second example is decentralized VPN. Latency matters one more time, because if you can't enable really fast hopping between different nodes, you have performance degradation and you have a bad VPN. And a slow VPN, no one will use it, no matter how private it is. The last example is a funny one. It's a Solana founder. He just DM'd me when we launched our fundraising, and he's building a fitness tracker. And I was like, wait, why doesn't it work on Solana? And he's like, you know what? I can't compute all the biometric data real time on Solana. I was like, you got it. We're a real time blockchain. So yes, we can host all your real time data, biometric data compute on MegaETH. So these are the 3 examples I got on top of my head. But every day, honestly, I get developers coming to me and they confess to me that most of their application actually don't use the chain. So I often joke, I said, devs these days are cheating the chain. So, and because they know it's just the current blockchains don't work. And I'm hoping I build an environment that they can come on and be comfortably breaking my chain so I can go and iterate on a better chain, find a better end game.
So you're referring to how a lot of deep networks have their hardware hosted, completely off-chain, but then the only thing on-chain is like their token, which you can trade on exchanges, right? Yeah, definitely. There's quite a few examples of that. Sanaba, what about you? Have you seen any interesting applications that are just not possible in current generation of blockchains?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you mentioned perptexes, and it's worth pointing out that decentralized perptexes, like Hyperliquid is the first attempt we've had that feels like it's really succeeding. But outside of that, it's kind of pathetic that like 3 years after the first perptex on-chain launched, they do like 5 to 7% of the volume of Binance. So like it's a big market and no one has succeeded at getting anywhere close is my current view. And some of that is obviously like for various reasons, but UI UX is a big one. And so enabling that is kind of really important. I think generally the way I think about it is bringing down the cost of trust is super important. And so people forget that like rollups did actually enable a whole bunch of cool applications. Like GMX could not have existed on L1. Friendtech could not have existed on L1. Fantasy Top could not have existed on L1. And so we did actually get a whole new wave of applications that utilize this cheaper, more interesting block space. And I think kind of what Shuyao was pointing to, bringing down the cost of trust just means that like, if you have to, like one way of thinking about it is, okay, you're asking a user to pay a fee for decentralization. If that fee is $10, then the only thing that it really makes sense to do is to make big transfers of ETH or like borrow hundreds of dollars. Like you can't actually buy $5 of a meme coin paying a $10 fee. When you bring that down to $1, then okay, there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff that I can actually move on chain. I can start bringing order books on chain, things like that. And I think if you get it down even lower, and I mean, Shuyao covered a lot of the use cases. A lot of these things that we think of as like fundamentally off-chain ideas are things that people aren't willing to pay for. Like very often when you talk to crypto apps, people are like, oh, why does this have crypto? Crypto imposes a huge cost on users. Like you have to use this different UI UX, you have to pay a lot more. And so we kind of constrain ourselves to thinking of places where users are very, very willing to pay for decentralization or very, very willing to pay for this like permissionlessness. And if we just kind of lower that cost, then a whole bunch of stuff that we don't think of as happening on chain can happen on chain and be more secure. And so that's kind of the lens I've always looked at it at, and which is why I always think like there's demand for cheaper and faster block space as long as in some sense there's demand for compute.
Because I think over time, a lot of people have adopted this quite cynical view that I've kind of talked about before as well, which is if you add crypto to any application, it rarely improves the user experience. In most cases, it actually degrades the user experience. So to think of crypto as like a type of tech that is inevitable is quite difficult for most people, because it makes no sense for me to want to pay for every single like I do on Twitter or pay for every single tweet. But if you bring the cost down to such like negligible levels that it basically becomes feature parity, I think that could happen. So I think you make a pretty good point there. And I think this is probably something that you guys spend a lot of time brainstorming about and kind of incubating even with MegaETH as well, right?
Yeah, I was going to say in one of Vitalik's recent blog posts, he's like, describe us, we are AWS with blockchain scaffolding. I thought I was... you have the crypto guarantee somewhere when you need it, but otherwise it feels like AWS. But yeah, I think you're right from a use case perspective. We love wacky crypto ideas, and I often joke like, I love to go back to 2017 ICO scams because back then there was no infrastructure, but they can actually be properly built. And things like, for example, decentralized Luma. Right. You might be asking, why it's 2024, why decentralize Luma? I think you're not being creative enough, right? Imagine you sign up for an activity. The moment you get into the event until you get out, you can clock the time. Then you can have very granular input of your personality and how you interact with the event. Or another example would be, I've been hosting Hop Out DAO for the last 4 years. My biggest freaking pain point is people don't show up. I'd love to implement a slashing mechanism, right? You stake some coins. If you don't show up, I'm going to slash you. And then suddenly you actually bring your real life on chain and you can do a lot of community activities. Like, I'm so excited about these use cases. We have an internal thesis that MegaETH needs to provide emotional value to people. Like, gone are the days where just a hyper financialized chain. People need to, love us, want to come us, want to play a game show with us. So I think, once we bring down the cost of bringing transaction on chain, everything needs to be on chain, because why not?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the social layer of a blockchain, which I think is different people have different interpretations of this, right? So if you look at Bitcoin, I think the social layer back in like 2008 and the early days was like cypherpunk, all these like underground threads, and people just are hardcore privacy maximalists. And then Ethereum, I think the kind of culture is very much kind of decentralization focused, very kind of DeFi adjacent. How would you describe, maybe zooming out from MegaETH a bit, first of all, how does a blockchain create its quote unquote culture? Because it seems to me like there's actually two, and some founders don't even realize there's two, which is the developers and then the token holders, which sometimes don't even overlap. The token holders are like the degens, and sometimes they don't even care about the tech, but you kind of need them to provide liquidity. And then you have the developers who sometimes don't really think about the token at all. They just want to build interesting applications. So how do you balance the culture between these two groups? How do you scale these two groups? How do you even get started with these two groups?
Yeah, I remember you asked me to think about the token community a few weeks ago. It's investor value add right there. So from MegaETH perspective, our thesis is the only way to solve an ecosystem cold start problem is by having really good applications. So we go after the developer community from the very beginning, very intentionally. And that's why we have the Mega Mafia program, which are just crack builders who are pushing the frontier of what could be possibly built on a high performance blockchain. And I think we are doing pretty well with the Mega Mafia program. I think now we are ready to go after the token community. And I would challenge actually all other blockchain founders have been doing the way that they've been doing. We're seeing a lot of people, paying shills on Twitter, and, you start having momentum, etc. I think these are tactics, but the most important way to build a community in my mind is how Solana did it, which is you have a group of people who are Solana maxis. Like, no matter what happened with Solana, even though, Solana at $12, which surprisingly has more activity than now Solana is $130, which I find it to be strange turn of events. They stay with the community. So to me, it was like, after building the developer community, I want the token community to have that level of loyalty. And to me, the only way to have that loyalty is when they actually love the dApps we have. And we don't become this, like, high FDV, low float VC chain. And I think the third one is we're building a culture that's fun. We are not being perceived as mercenary. And we don't do short-term oriented activities. We don't farm our community, etc. So all in all, it requires a lot of discipline, a lot of careful thinking. And we're, about to embark on this journey.
I like that there are a lot of subtle jabs in what you just described. So, Sana, I'm not going to make you name the specific chains, but have you seen good examples or bad examples of how communities are bootstrapped in either your portcos or in L1s that you've been kind of monitoring?
There's good and bad examples. And I mean, Solana's the big one, right? Because I think like in the last 4 years, that's the chain that's been successful. And I think in some sense, there's also like, you kind of have to choose to do something differently than what your rivals do. And Solana just does have this focus on shipping. It's like, okay, we are a bunch of people, we optimize for hardware, and we ship a bunch of useful stuff. That's the focus here. We're not constantly kind of like, Ethereum is just far more academic than Solana. Like, this is true. Like, if you go on ETH research, you can constantly find people writing really long threads about the future of ZK and new ways to prove things. And all of that is super interesting and super useful. And that's meant that Ethereum probably has very robust MEV infrastructure and stuff like that. But Solana has this focus on, let's just ship stuff. like eat glass and ship stuff, and it's kind of embodied by Anatoly. And I think that's been really useful to them. I actually know builders who like participate in something like Super Team, and they really like the focus on like, just build stuff, just ship it and get to market as fast as you can. And so increasingly, I do think, like I said, you have to choose to do something differently than what your rivals do, and you have to say no to some things. And I know people aren't very excited about Blast right now, but I do come back to it because I do think in a universe of boring L2s, Blast was not a boring L2. And some of the things they did was they said no. They said no to like, okay, we're not going to like chase after Uniswap and Aave and launch our chain with like Uniswap and Aave. We're actually going to launch our chain with Fantasy Top, Thruster, Juice, all these apps that people are like, okay, this is different, this is interesting, this is new. And so we're always kind of looking for differentiated strategies. The thing is though, I think ideally you want something that enables new apps plus a great community. One of the challenges is that like if there's nothing technical, then it feels like it doesn't last. And the cult thing is interesting because like there are people who are like shilling Polkadot on my timeline right now. They like still think Polkadot is the future. There are people who made money on Link in 2017 and never gave up. Like you can go to 4chan's business forum, and there is always a thread of people talking about how Link is going to go up. Like consistently for the last 8 years, I think. Like they just continue to believe in it. And so you do need a cult that's not stupid. Like I think that's important because clearly like Polkadot and Chainlink just don't matter that much anymore. And so I think there is a balance. And I definitely agree that like people like chains where there's interesting things to do. And that's in some ways what like Aptos and Sui haven't managed to do just yet, is build a place where there's interesting stuff to do. I also think particularly when it comes to tokens, people do need to zoom out. There's this sense in which like people really look at like, okay, the TGE was yesterday, this is what it's trading at, these investors made money, the airdrop was sold for this. And when you zoom out, like Solana had a 4-year cycle where it fell to 10 and came back. And a lot of its competitors that had gone up, like I remember last cycle, Sol Luna AVAX was like just like a consistent thing that people kept saying, Sol Luna AVAX. And it was just like, okay, these are the 3 blockchains of the future. And it turned out that actually Solana was the blockchain of the future. Luna was very much not the blockchain of the future. And AVAX has definitely lost some traction. And so I think there is like, people can get excited by prices going up and just kind of form mini cults. But the difference was that all through the bear market, Solana had a bunch of developers eating glass and building new apps. And so I do think this like very short-term focus on like, oh, this is what happened at your token launch and now it's game over for you. It's like kind of neither here nor there on like 4-5 year time horizons.
Yeah, I think that's the differentiation between token communities and developer communities. And to a certain extent, I also feel like you kind of need a Herculean effort in the beginning to bootstrap the community, right? For Solana, they almost had a patron in the form of FTX, where a lot of the early applications were built by FTX guys, right? Like Serum, there's a bunch of wallet, there's a bunch of like dashboards that were built by the FTX team, and then obviously I think the McAleenow twins, who just pretended to be 12 different teams and just bootstrap a lot of stuff. Like you can kind of shit on that and say, hey, FTX was a big scam and McAleenow twins were probably committed some sort of crime, but you could also argue that without that bootstrapping, there probably wouldn't have scaled as fast in terms of the developer mindshare. So I think right now the way that people try to replicate some element of that is just to do incubation. I think every single L1 should be having like a crack incubation team. Like to not incubate actually makes no sense to me. So I think what MegaETH is doing with the Mega Mafia, which you guys should check out if you're listening at home, is great. It's very interesting. Now, in the interest of time, I'd like to kind of wrap up by talking about an opportunity for L1s, right? Because we spent so much of the episode talking about how great Solana is. I'd like to be a bit fair and kind of maybe each of us can name something that we think Solana is not as good at that could be an opportunity for other L1s. And just to set aside our back biases, we will try to name L1s that are not MegaETH, or not Monad in this case, since we also brought up Monad. So what is the opportunity that Solana is not tackling today that maybe another L1 could tackle? I think one that Solana is not tackling, I think, is the market that Tron is tackling, which is like hyper cheap stablecoin payments in Asia. For some reason, I think in the early days, Solana was very, very prominent in Asia because FTX was based here and a lot of the Solana community was here. But then I think over this past cycle, a lot of the people who got involved with Solana when the token was trading very low was actually in the US first. A lot of builders were in the US. For some reason, they have kind of lost mindshare, at least anecdotally, in Asia. So I think, an Asia-focused kind of go-to-market, something like Tron could be a candidate for that.
I'm not sure I can name a specific L1. There's a couple of teams working on this, including one called Delta. But I think one idea that I have pretty often is that, a lot of crypto is like based on crypto economic mechanisms, where basically people put up collateral, say they'll do something, and if they don't do it, they get slashed. And I think we are still underestimating how much really efficient ZK changes all of that. And one of the thoughts I have pretty often is that, like, okay, if you start from first principles with ZK, you actually don't need stakers, you don't need proof of stake. Like a lot of constructions that we have in crypto are kind of like us trying to shovel ZK into, like the ZK rollups that currently exist are kind of trying to shovel ZK into Ethereum. And so if I had like a dark horse candidate, I think if you try and start with a blank slate on ZK and say, okay, I'm going to build an L1 that is just assumes that everyone can prove things and no one has to put up any collateral ever, there are no crypto economic mechanisms, and try and figure out what that looks like. And there are 3-4 teams working on that. That's like my current dark horse for where a lot of this industry is going, because this industry is super focused on crypto economic mechanisms, and ZK could actually break all of that. And it's a weird world to live in because it doesn't have a lot of place for tokens. That's kind of the scary part of ZK, because all our tokens kind of are used for staking and stuff, and it doesn't do much in ZK. And so maybe if you start from first principles, launch an L1 with no token that just is compute that is proved by everyone all the time.
You don't need token to do anything. Most tokens are governance token anyway, so public goods are good value proposition. I keep thinking about one of the tweets that Matt posted, a few months ago. He asked, Solana is not the place where Farcaster would happen. No one on Solana is innovating on the really frontier of things like decentralized social. We can talk about Solana having DePIN. I don't think any DePIN has serious product market fit yet, but really cypherpunky, very wacky ideas, I don't think are happening on Solana. I don't know what's the reason behind them. It seems to me very much a hyper financialized chain, right? I still think pumped out fund is the best thing that has happened to them, and there are different variation. We can go after that. I can't think about an L1 or L2 that replaced that. To me, that's why I'm passionate about Ethereum, to be honest, shameless plug. I do think as nerdy as the Ethereum community is, we're the one that dare to try something like Farcaster, actually make it a thing. And having Vitalik abandon Twitter, I just go full-time shit post over there. So I think that lack of innovation is something. I think opportunity, another layer 1 or layer 2 can come in.
So I guess gun to head, that chain might have to be base then.
No, wait, what? There's a chain here. I'm about to eat glass, literally. My conclusion.
Okay, I get. I'm trying to set aside our back biases, but okay. So Asia, ZK, and actually culture, which I never thought of. That's very, very interesting point that you brought up about Solana. So these three are probably some of the opportunities for infra builders of the future. I think this has been really, really fun. So for people who want to check out MegaETH or follow you, Shuyao, where should people go?
MegaETH Labs. Come to our website, read our white paper, but more important, come to our Discord. You can find it in our Twitter handle. Please don't follow me. I'm still trying to stay off as a dude. So if you're watching this, don't tell people I'm a girl, please.
Yeah, we'll include everything in the show notes except for your Twitter. Maybe we'll include your Twitter as well. But yeah, thanks for coming on, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you both.
Hey there, Jason here. Thanks for supporting another episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. If you enjoyed this, please give us a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and make sure you subscribe on YouTube so you can check out our founder interviews, our roundtable series on our venture thesis, as well as our On a Tangent sub-series about our current market views. And as always, you can reach out to me on X at Mr. Jason Choi, and I'll make sure to read every comment related to this episode. So I'll see you next time.